The first person Gohan saved in the boy's universe never learned his name. She only knew that the sky cracked open above Midtown Manhattan like something had punched through the ceiling of the world, and for exactly 1 second, one impossible, breathless second, something arrived that was stronger than fear. She was 32 years old. She had watched superheroes her whole life on billboards and cereal boxes and Vought-sponsored Instagram reels. She had never once felt safe around any of them. And then this happened. And she didn't know what to feel, because the thing that saved her didn't smile for the cameras. It didn't even look at them. It was supposed to be a routine Vought public event. Translucent was doing a hero engagement activation above Times Square. Branded parachute drop, crowd below, drones filming, the usual spectacle built to sell merch and push the new Vought streaming deal. Then the rig failed. 40 civilians on a suspended observation platform 300 feet up, cables snapping one by one, screaming, shredding through the midday noise. Vought's emergency PR team scrambled. Their actual heroes? Homelander was in a debrief. A-Train was in contract negotiations. Queen Maeve's status was classified. There was nobody, just 40 people in a crumbling platform and a crowd below watching it happen live on their phones like it was content. He came from the east. No announcement, no landing lights, no brand, just a figure moving at a speed that made every camera on the ground fail to track him properly. A blur of something that hit the platform with surgical precision and held it. Held the entire weight of it, cables and steel and 40 screaming strangers, with 2 hands and no expression of strain. The crowd went completely silent. Not the silence of relief. The silence of something the human brain registers before language catches up. This is a different category of thing. He set the platform down on the street as gently as you'd place a sleeping child in a crib. Then he looked at the crowd. And then he left. No speech, no logo, nothing. The footage went everywhere in under 4 minutes, not because of the rescue itself. Vought had scripted dozens of those, but because of what was missing from it. No hesitation about angles, no camera awareness, no pausing for the shot. He had moved like someone who was not performing heroism but simply doing it, the way you'd pull a friend back from a curb without thinking. To anyone who had grown up watching The Seven, who had watched Homelander laser beam a smile into crowds while people bled off screen, this was disorienting in a way that felt almost violent. The comment sections cracked in half within the hour. Half the world typed, "Who is he?" The other half typed, "What is he?" Vought's crisis division had a protocol for unknown superpowered entities. They had run it 3 times before, twice for rogue compound phi subjects, once for a foreign soup they needed to neutralize quietly before a Senate hearing. The protocol assumed the unknown entity wanted something: money, power, legitimacy, safety. It assumed leverage existed somewhere. Senior VP Ashley Barrett pulled the footage 47 times in 90 minutes looking for the leverage point and found nothing. No sponsor tag, no agent contact, no social footprint, no compound V markers in any scan they could pull from the drone footage. He had appeared, acted, and vanished. He had given them nothing to buy, nothing to threaten, and nothing to spin. That was the first moment Ashley Barrett felt genuinely afraid on the job. 3 miles away, in a Vought Tower penthouse that smelled like leather and ozone and something darker underneath, Homelander watched the same footage on loop. His expression did not change. His jaw was perfectly still. His eyes did the thing they sometimes did when he was working very hard to appear unbothered, that faint blue-white pulse at the edge of his irises like a circuit testing its load. He watched the rescue. He watched the crowd's silence. He watched the absence of performance in every frame. And then he said, quietly, to no one. He didn't even wave. There was something in his voice that was not anger yet. It was the specific tone of a man who has spent his entire life being the most powerful thing in every room, suddenly doing arithmetic he doesn't like the answer to. Billy Butcher got the footage from Huey, who got it from Starlight, who sent it with no caption, just the clip and a single period. Butcher watched it once, then he watched it again. Then he set his phone face down on the table and sat very still for a long time, which was something those around him had learned to recognize as more dangerous than when he was loud. Frenchie called it the dead water look. Huey asked what he thought. Butcher picked his phone back up, watched the rescue one more time, and said 4 words with the careful flatness of a man rewriting his entire operational framework in real time. That's a different problem. Gohan had not planned to stay. He never planned anything like this. The arrivals always happened the same way, pulled by something he couldn't name toward a place where someone needed help. The same instinct that had dragged him into every fight since he was old enough to understand what losing meant. But standing now in a quiet alley off 44th Street, listening to the city recalibrate around what had just happened, he felt something he hadn't expected. Not relief, not danger. Wrongness. The kind that settled in the chest slowly, like water finding cracks in stone. Something about this place was off in a way that had nothing to do with what he'd just stopped. Something was broken here at a level that one rescue couldn't reach. He just didn't know yet how deep it went. He would. And if this channel covers the stories that start exactly like this, one moment of real hope landing in a world designed to destroy it, then subscribe now, because this is only the beginning, and where it ends is not where you think. To understand why Gohan's arrival matters, you have to understand what he is at his core, and more importantly, what he refuses to be. He is not the strongest fighter in Dragon Ball history. That title has passed through too many hands, ascended too many transformations, survived too many impossible power ceilings to belong to any one person permanently. But Gohan occupies something rarer than the top of a power scale. He is a being of catastrophic destructive potential who genuinely, constitutionally, does not want to use it. Every other fighter in his world, his father, Vegeta, even Piccolo, carries some thread of love for the fight itself. Gohan never did. He fights because people he loves will die if he doesn't. That distinction sounds small. In the boys' universe, it is the most alien thing imaginable. His power, at its ceiling, bends physics. Not in the theatrical way Homelander's heat vision bends steel. That is impressive by human standards, a weapon, a threat. Gohan at full output operates on a different numerical axis entirely, the kind that makes military hardware feel like pointing a flashlight at a hurricane. Half awakened, holding back by instinct, he is still operating at a level that no compound Vi subject has ever approached. But here is the thing that no Vought analyst would be able to process cleanly when they finally got him in a briefing room. He would sit there calmly, listen to their threats, and feel something closer to sadness than fear. Not arrogance. Sadness. The kind you feel watching someone point a broken weapon at you and not knowing how to tell them gently that it won't work. Now set that figure down inside the boy's universe and let your eyes adjust to what surrounds him. Vought International is not a company in any sense the word was originally meant to carry. It is a theological institution built on advertising and blood, a machine that converts human fear into quarterly earnings by manufacturing the exact monsters it claims to protect the public from. Every hero on their roster was engineered, branded, and psychologically shaped since childhood to serve the product. Their heroism is not a value, it is a content vertical. Their rescues are not operations, they are activations. The difference between a Vought hero saving your life and a Vought hero letting you die is not morality. It is whether the cameras are positioned correctly. Homelander is the apex expression of this system. And the most important thing to understand about him before this story can be told properly is that he is not simply evil. Evil is too clean, too simple, too flattering. He is what happens when a being of godlike physical power is raised inside an institution that taught him he deserved worship before he understood what deserving meant. He is a child's emotional architecture running inside a god's body, and the specific thing that runs his every decision, louder than cruelty, louder than anger, louder than the violence, is the need to be the most important thing in every room he enters. That need is the load-bearing wall of his entire psychology. And Gohan's arrival, that single footage clip, already has hairline fractures running up it. The Seven and the broader ecosystem of Vought-sponsored soups operate on a fundamental social contract with the public. You fear us, we perform safety, everyone pretends the transaction is heroism. This contract depends entirely on the public having no reference point for what real protection looks like. Give them a comparison and the whole architecture shakes. Think about what Gohan's rescue actually communicated in the language the crowd absorbed emotionally, not intellectually. No hesitation, no audience awareness, no brand moment, no collateral damage. 40 people were going to die, and then they were not, and the reason they were not had nothing to do with who was watching. That is not how heroism has ever worked in this world. That footage is not just viral content, it is a structural threat delivered in 45 seconds of silent, unbranded competence. Butcher's world runs on a different kind of infection. His entire operational philosophy, every compromise, every brutal choice, every moment he has crossed a line he told himself he'd never cross, is underwritten by one foundational belief. Soups are wrong. Not dangerous. Not misguided. Wrong. The Compound V revelation only deepened it. They were built wrong, motivated wrong, wired wrong at the root, and the only moral response to that wrongness is elimination. His hatred is not irrational. It is the most coherent thing about him. It is also, as of approximately 45 minutes after Gohan's footage spread, experiencing its first genuine philosophical crisis, because Butcher has spent years building a case that power corrupts absolutely, and he just watched something with more raw power than anything in his universe walk away from cameras without once looking at them for approval. Starlight saw the footage in a green room between a Vought media training session and a brand partnership signing she had not agreed to but had been scheduled into anyway. She watched it on her phone with her stylist talking in the background about color palettes for the new 7 campaign, and she felt something she had almost forgotten the shape of: recognition. Not of Gohan specifically, of the behavior. Of a person acting from instinct instead of positioning, from care instead of brand calculus, from the actual center of what the word hero was always supposed to mean before Vought got their hands on it and turned it into a trademark. Her stylist asked if she was okay. She said yes, she was not. She was remembering who she had been before all of this, and that kind of memory in Vought's world is its own specific kind of danger. Gohan spent his first full night in this universe on a rooftop in Queens listening, not for threats, for signal. He had learned early that you could understand a place not by its skyline but by its ambient noise, the texture of how a city breathed at night, what it carried underneath the traffic and the wind. What he heard in this city was familiar in structure and wrong in tone. The sirens sounded right. The distant conversations sounded right, but underneath all of it, persistent and low and woven into everything, was something he'd felt before in places where the powerful had been hurting people for so long that the fear had stopped being a response and started being the atmosphere. He had walked into war zones. He had stood at the edge of civilizations being destroyed. He knew the specific frequency of a world that had been told for long enough that this was just how things were. He sat on that rooftop and he listened to it for a long time. And somewhere across the city, Vought's servers were already building a file with his face on the cover, and Homelander was still awake, and the footage was still spreading, and the machine was beginning to decide what to do about the thing it could not categorize. Something was about to break. The only question was which side broke first. Vought's intelligence apparatus was not designed for humility, but it was designed for speed. Within 72 hours of the Times Square footage going supernova across every platform, the Crisis Division had assembled a working file on the unknown entity that ran to 412 pages of speculation, 0 pages of confirmed fact, and 1 internal memo from the head of the Super Biological Research Division that had been flagged, reviewed, and quietly buried because its conclusion was too destabilizing to circulate. The memo said, in the careful language of a scientist trying not to sound panicked, the subject's physical output during the platform rescue, extrapolated from structural stress analysis of the cables and frame, suggested force application at a level that had no precedent in any Compound V subject ever documented. It suggested further that this was not his maximum output. It suggested he had been careful. That memo stayed buried. What rose instead was the PR strategy, because Vought had long ago learned that when you cannot answer a question, you must control who gets to ask it. The first wave of narrative was elegant in its simplicity. Unnamed sources, which meant Vought's media architecture, which meant Ashley Barrett on 3 phones simultaneously, began feeding selected outlets a consistent thread. The unknown hero was foreign. Not foreign in the sense of nationality, but foreign in the sense of values. Unvetted, unaccountable, operating outside the regulatory framework that kept superhumans safe for public interaction. The word rogue appeared in 11 separate articles within 24 hours, placed with surgical precision in publications that reached exactly the demographics Vought needed to feel nervous. They didn't claim he was dangerous outright. They didn't have to. They just built the frame carefully, one plank at a time, until the frame said danger without any single board needing to say it alone. It was a technique they had used before, on journalists, on politicians, on their own heroes when they got difficult. It had never once failed them against a human target. Gohan noticed the shift in the coverage with the specific tiredness of someone who has watched information get weaponized before and still finds it exhausting every time. He didn't have a television. He didn't have a phone. He had the city itself, which in the modern age was saturated enough with screens and sound that you could absorb the news cycle simply by moving through it at street level, reading headlines through glass storefronts, listening to morning radio bleeding from delivery trucks, watching the body language of people as the narrative about him evolved from curiosity to unease. What bothered him was not that Vought was lying. He had expected that much from a system this dead. What bothered him was how naturally the public reached for the offered frame. How fast people who had been terrified of Homelander for years found it easier to distrust something new than to question something familiar. Fear was a habit here, he was realizing, and habits were harder to break than bones. Homelander's first public move was masterfully calibrated, which meant someone had written it for him, and he had delivered it with enough genuine contempt to make it land. A spontaneous rooftop interview, engineered to appear spontaneous, timed for maximum viewership, in which he was asked directly about the Times Square incident. He smiled. The smile was the one he used when he needed to appear magnanimous while saying something that would get the target isolated. He said he was glad civilians were safe. He said he welcomed any being who wanted to help protect the American people. He said with the pause of a man placing a knife on a table rather than drawing it, "I just think the public deserves to know who's watching over them. Transparency, accountability. That's what the 7 have always stood for." The applause was immediate. The message for anyone fluent in Homelander was crystal clear. Declare yourself, submit to the structure, or become the enemy. Gohan did not respond, not because he was ignoring the message, he had understood it perfectly, but because the response the situation was baiting him toward was a public declaration, a positioning statement, an entrance into the media game on media terms. He had watched enough of this world's dynamics by now to understand that entering that game meant accepting its rules, and its rules were designed so that Vought always controlled the board. So he stayed quiet, and he stayed visible, and he kept doing exactly what he had been doing, moving toward emergencies, applying precise and minimal force, leaving before the cameras could lock onto him long enough to build a narrative. This, more than anything else he could have done, was driving Homelander toward the particular edge where performance anxiety shades into something genuinely dangerous. The boys had their first proper meeting about Gohan on a Wednesday afternoon in the back of Butcher's current safe house, a converted storage unit in Red Hook that smelled like damp concrete and old takeout. Butcher laid out what they knew, which was not much. Kimiko had been closest to the Times Square rescue and had watched the whole thing from across the street. She communicated her read of him through gestures and expressions that Frenchie translated with his usual mix of accuracy and editorial embellishment. Controlled, precise, not performing, genuinely calm. The last point delivered with the slightly unsettled inflection of someone describing something they hadn't seen before and weren't sure they trusted. Huey said he seemed different. Butcher said everything seemed different until it wasn't. Said they needed more information before anyone decided anything. These were all reasonable positions. None of them accounted for Starlight, who said quietly from the corner that she'd met him briefly that morning and that the meeting had changed her understanding of several things she thought she already knew. Starlight had found him, or he had found her, she wasn't entirely sure which, near the river at dawn, Two people who both happened to be somewhere quieter than the city's center, both processing something the city itself didn't have vocabulary for. They hadn't spoken long. He had asked her, with a directness that wasn't aggressive but wasn't soft either, the kind of directness that assumed honesty as a default. The system here, the heroes, the company, does it ever actually protect people? She had laughed, then stopped laughing, then stood there with the weight of everything she had done and compromised and survived pressing down on her from above while the answer formed itself honestly in her mouth. She said, "Not really. Not the way you mean." He had nodded. Not surprised, not satisfied, just absorbing it, the way someone absorbs a confirmation of something they were hoping not to confirm. He thanked her, and she stood there after he left, feeling scraped clean in a way that was not entirely unpleasant, and almost entirely terrifying. The incident that detonated the second phase happened on a Thursday. It was not planned by anyone, or rather, it was planned by Vought as a controlled test, a scenario they had engineered to provoke a measurable public response from the unknown entity, a staged chemical spill near a crowded transit hub designed to require visible soup intervention so they could watch how he operated under pressure. What they had not planned for was Translucent, running the operation on site as their covert observer, deciding to accelerate the situation by endangering a specific cluster of civilians to force a quicker response. What they had also not planned for was Gohan arriving 40 seconds earlier than their models had projected, managing the entire spill with contained precision, and then, when Translucent moved to engage him directly in what was supposed to be a quick assessment of his combative threshold, moving aside Translucent's first strike with such casual economy of motion that every Vought operative watching the feed went completely silent. He hadn't countered. He hadn't threatened. He had simply moved, the way water moves around a stone, and looked at Translucent with an expression that translated across every cultural barrier as, "Please don't do that again." Translucent had frozen. The feed had frozen. And in Vought Tower, watching the replay for the third time, Ashley Barrett said to no one in particular, "We need a different strategy." 3 floors up, Homelander was already formulating one, and it involved considerably less restraint. The fracture in public opinion happened the way most structural collapses happen, not all at once, but in a sequence of small failures that each made the next one inevitable. By the end of the first week, Gohan had intervened in 11 separate incidents across the city: a building fire in the Bronx, a bridge collapse in New Jersey, 2 separate armed engagements that would have ended in mass casualties, and 6 smaller emergencies that never made the primary news cycle because Vought's media infrastructure had developed a quiet policy of minimizing his coverage wherever possible. But minimizing coverage of something is not the same as controlling the narrative around it, especially when 40 million phones are in 40 million pockets, and every person who watched him work in person came away with the same raw, unprocessed reaction. This was different. This was not the 7. This was not performance. And that observation, spreading person to person through the organic and ungovernable channels that Vought had never fully colonized, began splitting the country along a fault line that had always been there, waiting for exactly this kind of pressure. Camp 1 was the believers. They formed fast and they formed loud, the way hope always moves in populations that have been running on fear for too long, with a desperate velocity, as though they knew they needed to build Saisas thing before someone knocked it down. Social media filled with footage compilations, with frame-by-frame analyses of his rescues, with the specific reverence that people reserve for things they recognize as real in a world saturated with artificial. They made signs. They gathered in public spaces. Someone started a petition to give him official recognition that collected 2 million signatures in 36 hours. They called him things: names, titles, classifications that he had not asked for and would not have wanted, because the human need to name and own the things that save you is powerful and ancient and does not require the saved thing's permission. He was becoming a symbol before he had agreed to become anything at all. Camp 2 was the loyalists, and they were louder in different registers. These were the people for whom Vought was not a company, but a cosmology, whose understanding of safety, of order, of what the world owed them in exchange for their compliance ran entirely through the machinery Vought had built. To them, an unbranded, unaccountable, unregulated superpowered entity operating inside their city without corporate oversight was not a hero. It was a threat category. They did not need Vaught's talking points to reach this conclusion, though Vought was certainly providing them. They needed only their existing architecture of belief, which had been carefully constructed over decades to make institutional authority feel like personal safety. When Vought said accountability, these people heard their own voice speaking. That was the design. It had always been the design. Camp 3 was smaller and quieter and more dangerous than either of the others because it was made of people and institutions. Government offices, military command structures, intelligence divisions, whose job was not to have opinions but to assess threats, and who were looking at the same footage everyone else was looking at and running different calculations. These were people who had built their entire understanding of the superpowered threat matrix around Compound 5, around Vaught's grudging cooperation, around the fragile regulatory fiction that kept Supes nominally accountable to something resembling law. Gohan did not fit anywhere in that matrix. He had no known origin, no leverage point, no institutional affiliation, no nationality, no traceable biology. He was, in the language of the risk assessment documents already circulating through classified channels, a category undefined entity with demonstrated capacity to negate every existing response protocol. 3 separate black site programs were quietly reactivated. None of them would matter, but nobody in those rooms knew that yet. Vaught's evolved strategy arrived in the form of a media campaign of stunning cynicism, even by their standards. The new narrative, road-tested through focus groups and sentiment analysis and the specific expertise of people whose entire professional skill was making lies feel like common sense, went like this. Gohan was not evil. They were not saying that. They were simply concerned. Concerned the way any responsible institution would be concerned about an unknown variable operating without oversight in a densely populated urban environment. They ran segments on 3 networks simultaneously. They owned 2 of them outright, featuring sober-faced analysts in expensive suits discussing the philosophical question of accountability, the genuine public safety issues raised by ungoverned superpowered activity, the lessons of history regarding unchecked individual power. They never mentioned his name. They never showed his footage. They showed the aftermath of his rescues, structural damage, disrupted transit, traumatized bystanders, without the context of what had caused the emergencies he'd been responding to. It was a masterwork of editorial omission. It moved the needle on public unease by 11 percentage points in 4 days. The human cost of this campaign was not abstract, and this is where the story demands you step out of the analytical frame for a moment and into the street. Picture a family in the Bronx, mother, father, 12-year-old daughter, who had been in the building fire he extinguished in the first week. The daughter had seen him through the smoke, had seen him moving through it without any visible distress, carrying people out with the specific gentleness of someone who was terrified of using too much force, setting them down outside with a care that looked almost incongruous given the scale of what he was doing. She had told her parents and her teacher and anyone who would listen that she had seen someone actually trying to help, not performing help, actually trying. 3 weeks later, her school, a public school in a district with a Vought-sponsored safety partnership, ran an assembly about super safety awareness that used imagery and language that made the being she had seen in that burning building sound like a threat. She sat in the assembly and felt something she was too young to have a precise word for, but that was, at its core, the specific grief of watching a true thing get made into a lie in front of your eyes. Ryan saw the footage in a different context, in a room that Butcher didn't know he had access to, on a device that connected him to the parts of the internet that weren't curated by the adults around him. He was a child who had grown up understanding power as a burden, as something that leaked out of him at the wrong moments and hurt people, as something that required constant management and suppression and shame. He had watched Homelander his whole life and understood instinctively, in the wordless way children understand the emotional subtext beneath adult performances, that what Homelander modeled was not what Ryan wanted to be. But he had never seen what he did want to be, because he had never seen anyone with power that scale handle it with that kind of quietness. He watched Gohan's footage on a small screen in a room that smelled like new carpet and old secrets, and he watched it 3 times. And the 3rd time, he was not watching the rescue. He was watching Gohan's hands, the way they moved, the way they held things, the care in them. He sat with that for a long time afterward, not saying anything to anyone, carrying it somewhere private and protected, the way children carry the things that matter most. Butcher's fracture was happening more slowly than Ryan's, and with considerably more resistance, which was appropriate because Butcher was a man who had survived by the rigidity of his convictions and had no safe procedure for revising them. He had spent a week watching Gohan's movements, cross-referencing incident reports, building a profile the way he built all his profiles, through pattern recognition, through behavioral analysis, through the accumulated expertise of a man who had been studying superpowered humans as an adversarial problem for years. And the profile was coming back wrong. Not wrong in the sense of dangerous, wrong in the sense that it kept failing to confirm what he needed it to confirm. There was no pattern of territorial behavior, no resource acquisition, no alignment seeking with power structures, no evidence of a hidden agenda running beneath the visible altruism. Every data point he collected pointed toward the same conclusion he was not prepared to reach. The thing was exactly what it looked like. And for Butcher, that was somehow the most destabilizing possibility of all, because his entire worldview had been constructed on the foundational premise that nothing with that much power was ever exactly what it looked like. If he was wrong about this, his mind kept asking in the small hours of the night, the question arriving not loudly but with the patient, cold persistence of water finding a crack. What else was he wrong about? He did not answer. He poured another drink. But the question stayed. It was not going anywhere. Homelander stopped sleeping around day 12. Not because he couldn't. He had gone without sleep before, had pushed his body through 72-hour stretches of sustained activity without meaningful degradation, but because sleep required a particular relationship with your own mind, a temporary surrender of control to whatever waited in the quieter parts of consciousness, and what waited in Homelander's quieter parts had recently become unbearable company. He lay in his penthouse at 3 a.m, staring at the ceiling with the city's ambient light painting patterns across it, running the same sequence of thoughts on repeat with the obsessive, grinding quality of a machine that is jammed on a specific operation. The footage. The crowd's silence, the absence of performance, the hands that had held 40 people and then let go without waiting for applause. He kept returning to those hands. He kept trying to find the calculation in them and finding none. It was making him feel something he had spent his entire life constructing elaborate psychological infrastructure specifically to never feel: small. The performance of confidence he delivered publicly during this period was, by general consensus among the Vought communications team, some of his finest work. He did 3 major public appearances in 5 days, each one calibrated to maximum audience impact. A disaster response in Louisiana that he handled with visible heroism and excellent camera placement. A national address about the integrity of American superhero institutions that drew record viewership. And a personal appearance at a children's hospital that generated the specific quality of viral content Vought called emotional equity, the kind that made people defend you instinctively when your name came under attack. He smiled through all of it with perfect consistency. He delivered every line exactly as written. He shook every hand and held every child and stood in every beam of carefully designed light. And backstage, in the green rooms and corridors and black SUVs, he was coming apart at a frequency that only people very close to him could detect. And those people had learned long ago that detecting it and surviving it required keeping what you saw entirely to yourself. What was corroding him from the inside was not simply the power differential. He had processed that much intellectually, had run the rough calculations from the footage, and arrived at a number that was uncomfortable but survivable as a concept. What was corroding him was the indifference. Not indifference toward him specifically, though that was certainly part of it, but a more fundamental indifference toward the entire apparatus that had always kept him central. The cameras, the ratings, the public love, the fear, the branding, the spectacle machinery that had been the load-bearing structure of his identity since before he could form full sentences. Gohan moved through all of it like it wasn't there, not with contempt. Contempt would have been manageable, even pleasant, because contempt acknowledged the thing it dismissed. This was something quieter and more annihilating, genuine disinterest. The heroism was not for the audience. It was not for anything Homelander had a category for. And in the specific, airless interior of Homelander's psychology, where everything was ultimately about him and his position and his necessity, this registered not as a philosophical difference, but as an existential threat that needed to be resolved through the only language he had ever fully trusted. The scenario Homelander designed, and he designed it himself, cutting Ashley and the communications team out of the planning loop entirely, which was how they knew it was going to be bad, was built around a single tactical insight. Gohan's restraint was not a limitation, it was a choice, and choices could be removed. The scenario needed to create a situation where Gohan's options were reduced to exactly two: demonstrate his full capacity publicly, thereby confirming the danger narrative Vought had been building, or fail to act and lose the moral authority his presence had been accumulating. The execution required a credible threat, a public venue, and a set of stakes that Gohan's specific psychology, that protective instinct, that deep reflexive horror of civilian harm, could not navigate around. It required, in other words, using Gohan's goodness as a weapon against him. Homelander spent 3 days building it. He had never in his life designed something with more personal investment. He had also never in his life felt the specific vulnerability of a man who is committing fully to a plan while privately suspecting the person he's planning against may be so far outside his experience that the plan cannot account for them. Starlight found out about it through the same network of fractured trust and careful observation that had kept her alive inside Vought for years. A half-overheard conversation, a communications log she wasn't supposed to access, a pattern of logistics movements that only made sense as preparation for something large and public and deliberately uncontrolled. She sat with the information for 2 hours, running through her options with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that in Vought's world, your options were always fewer than they appeared, and the window to act on them was always shorter. Then she did the thing that 6 months ago she would not have done, that the version of herself who had arrived at the Seven as a bright-eyed idealist and been systematically ground into careful compliance would not have been able to do. She went to find Gohan. Not to warn him exactly. He didn't need warning the way she needed warning. He was not going to be killed by whatever Homelander had planned. She went because she needed him to understand something about this world that she suspected he still didn't fully grasp, something that couldn't be communicated through observation alone. She found him on the same rooftop in Queens where he had spent his first night, which she had located not through tracking technology or intelligence resources, but through the simple method of thinking about where someone who wanted to understand a city would go to listen to it. She told him about the plan, what she knew of it, which was enough. He listened without interrupting, without his expression shifting through the performance of reactions the way people did when they were processing information emotionally in real time. He simply listened, with the complete quality of attention that she had noticed in him from the beginning, and that she now understood was not passivity, but its opposite. An active, total presence that most people never achieved because they were too busy preparing their response to hear what was actually being said. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How many people does he usually put at risk when he does something like this?" She told him the number from 3 previous incidents she had documented. He nodded. He said, "Then I'll be there. Simple. Final. No heroics in the delivery, just the flat certainty of someone for whom the calculation had only one possible answer." The boys found out about the operation through MM's contact at a federal oversight division, delivered via a message that was 3 sentences long and read like someone who was very afraid of what they were passing along. Butcher assembled the team at 2 in the afternoon with 5 hours before the projected window of the event. The briefing was short. The plan, such as it was, involved being present without being useful, which was the specific tactical posture of people who were trying to navigate a scenario involving a minimum of 2 beings whose physical capacity made every conventional option they possessed largely decorative. Frenchie ran the numbers on what they could realistically contribute to an engagement at the projected scale and went quiet in a way that communicated the results more clearly than any verbal report. Huey asked Butcher directly, "If it goes wrong, if Gohan has to let loose fully, what does that look like?" Butcher looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man who has done the math on something he didn't want to do the math on. He said, "Different. It looks different to anything we've seen." Kimiko caught Butcher's eyes across the room and held them for a second, and something passed between them that the others didn't catch. The specific recognition between two people who have operations, aided in extreme situations long enough to know the texture of a moment that will divide time into before and after. The location Homelander had chosen was Yankee Stadium during a nationally televised event with a sold-out crowd of 54,000 people, because Homelander understood above all things the grammar of scale. The way larger numbers made everything feel more ultimate, more necessary, more like the kind of moment that required exactly him. The false flag was elegant, a manufactured structural crisis, the stadium's support systems compromised through Vought's deep technical infrastructure, combined with a very real and very deliberate threat to a specific person Gohan had been observed to have contact with. Starlight, present at the event in her 7 capacity, in a position of genuine danger that would not resolve itself without direct intervention. 54,000 people. Live national broadcast. One clear message. Come out, show yourself fully, and let the world see what you are. Or don't come, and let them see what you chose over them. Homelander stood in the private booth above the field and looked out at the crowd filling the seats and felt for the first time in 2 weeks something approaching calm. He had set the stage. He had written the terms. This was his world, his rules, his cameras. He was certain, with the specific certainty of a man who has never genuinely lost, that this was where the story turned back in his favor. He was wrong, but he didn't know that yet. And for these last few hours before the world changed irrevocably, he stood in his booth and smiled his smile and looked like everything he had always needed to appear to be. Somewhere below, 54,000 people settled into their seats. Somewhere across the city, Gohan was already moving. The structural failures began at 7:43 p.m. Eastern Time, 17 minutes into the broadcast. They began small, the way catastrophic failures always begin small, the way the largest avalanches size. Art with a single gram of displaced snow, a pressure anomaly in the eastern load-bearing column, a tremor in the upper deck support lattice that the stadium's automated monitoring system flagged, and then, because Vought's technical team had spent 3 days quietly rewriting the alert thresholds, did not escalate. 54,000 people felt nothing. The broadcast continued. Homelander appeared on the field to a roar that he absorbed with the practiced ease of someone who had been absorbing roars their entire life, who needed them the way other organisms needed oxygen. And he stood in the lights and smiled, and the crowd gave him exactly what he had come for, which was every eye in the building and every camera trained on the singular fact of his presence. He was in complete control. The stage was his. The night was his. Everything that followed in the next 4 minutes would happen on his terms, and the world would watch it happen. And when it was over, the question of who mattered in this city would be settled permanently and publicly and in a language everyone could read. Starlight felt the first genuine structural shift at 7:51 and understood immediately that it was not accidental. The specific quality of the vibration through the floor of the field. Not the organic, random resonance of a building under crowd load, but something deliberate, targeted, engineered. Communicated to her body the way professional experience communicates things that the conscious mind is still catching up with. This was a setup. She was in the center of it, and the danger to her was real. She had known this intellectually since her conversation with Gohan on the rooftop. Feeling it in the soles of her feet while 54,000 people cheered around her was a different category of knowledge. She did not run. Running would have triggered panic in the crowd and given Homelander too, the chaos variable he wanted before the scenario was fully loaded. She stood on the field and she activated her light and she looked up at the private booth where she knew he was watching, and she thought, with the cold, clear precision of someone who has been afraid enough times to move through it, he is going to find out tonight that he designed this for the wrong variable. She was right, but being right was going to cost something. The eastern column failed at 7:53, not fully. Vought's engineers had calibrated the failure to be dramatic without being immediately lethal, a controlled degradation designed to produce visible, broadcast-ready structural distress without actual collapse. The upper deck on the eastern side began a slow, grinding downward shift. The crowd in that section registered at first as confusion, then as alarm, and then as the shift accelerated past the calibrated threshold because the engineers had made a calculation error that no one would ever publicly acknowledge, as genuine animal terror. The stampede began in section 214 and spread in both directions simultaneously, the specific physics of panicked crowd movement converting the stadium's architecture into a threat multiplier. The exits suddenly inadequate for the volume of bodies trying to reach them, the field below becoming a landing zone for people who were going to fall whether they chose to or not. Homelander watched this from his booth and felt something cold touch the edge of his certainty because the number of people in genuine danger had just exceeded his projected parameters. He had wanted controlled threat. What he had was the beginning of a real disaster. He told himself it didn't matter. He had a role to play. He descended toward the field. Gohan arrived at 7:54 and the cameras caught it this time. Not one camera, not a phone at street level, but 17 broadcast cameras simultaneously, all of them trained on the stadium when the East by. Ren's section shifted and all of them capturing the same image from different angles at the same moment. A figure coming in from the north at a velocity that created a visible pressure wave in the stadium's ambient light that bent the air the way extreme speed bends air, that arrived at the failing column not in the time it takes to respond to something, but in the time it takes to perceive it. He hit the column with both hands and the degradation stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. 54,000 people, or the portion of them not yet in full flight, experienced a half-second of complete sensory confusion, the specific cognitive disruption of watching physics assert a new rule mid-event. Then the upper deck, rather than resuming its shift, began to stabilize, and the stabilization radiated outward through the structure the way a calm voice radiates through a panicked crowd. Not instantly, but with the kind of quiet authority that panic cannot long resist. In the broadcast booth, the director made the decision in real time that every director in American television history would have made in that moment. He kept all 17 cameras rolling. Homelander landed on the field 30 seconds later, and the geometry of what he encountered was everything he had not prepared for. Gohan was visible, fully visible. No longer a blur, but a person standing at the base of the restored column with his hands still on the steel, assessing the rest of the structure with the focused, methodical attention of an engineer running a rapid diagnostic. The crowd that remained on the field had pulled back instinctively, not in fear of him specifically, but in the animal awareness of proximity to something operating at a different scale. The cameras were everywhere. And Homelander was standing in the middle of it all in his suit with his cape and his smile and his perfectly positioned lighting, and none of it, not one element of the performance infrastructure he had spent his entire life constructing, was doing the thing it was supposed to do, because nobody in the stadium and nobody watching at home was looking at him. They were all looking at the other one, the one without the costume, the one without the brand, the one who had arrived 11 seconds before him and fixed the thing that was breaking and not yet turned around to acknowledge the cameras because he was still checking whether anything else needed to be fixed. This was the moment. This was the specific, crystalline, publicly broadcast moment when Homelander understood that he had designed a stage for a confrontation, and the confrontation's other participant had not walked onto the stage. He had walked past it. He was busy. What happened next was not strategic. The part of Homelander that was still capable of strategy had gone completely offline. What happened next was the specific product of a psychology that had been stretched to its breaking point over 2 weeks of accumulated humiliation and was now in the presence of the source of that humiliation on a live national broadcast in front of the largest crowd either of them had access to. He moved toward Gohan. Not with a speech prepared, not with a PR angle loaded, not with any of the careful architecture of performed dominance that had always mediated his violence before. He moved the way he moved when the cameras had always been off and the room had always been empty and the person in front of him had no protections left. Directly, quickly, with the specific blank quality of intention that had no interest in how it looked. The heat vision came first, not a warning, a full power opening strike, the kind he used when he needed something to stop existing. It was the most powerful thing in the boy's universe, and it hit Gohan in the center of his back as he was still assessing the column, and Gohan turned around, and he was fine, and the expression on his face was not anger. It was the particular sadness of someone who had been hoping very hard not to be confirmed in their worst suspicion about a place, and had just been confirmed. The exchange that followed lasted 47 seconds, and was, in its technical dimensions, not a fight. A fight requires meaningful exchange between parties operating within a comparable range of capacity. This was more like watching someone try to extinguish a river with a lighter. Not because Homelander was weak by any absolute measure, but because the scale differential, fully expressed even in those 47 seconds with Gohan still visibly restraining himself, was simply beyond the vocabulary the stadium or the broadcast or any observer had any framework to accommodate. Homelander hit him 7 times at full capacity. Each time, Gohan absorbed it, repositioned, and responded with exactly sufficient force to remove the threat without destruction. Enough to end the aggression, not enough to cause harm, calibrated with the agonizing precision of someone who was terrified of what happened if the calibration slipped. The crowd watched in the silence of people witnessing something outside every category they possessed. The cameras ran, every one of them, and in the booth above the field, where the boys had positioned themselves with the specific tactical futility of people who had known from the beginning they would not be the ones to end this. Butcher stood with his hands on the railing and watched the 47 seconds and felt his foundational architecture crack from the foundation up, one conviction at a time, in the specific slow way to beliefs collapse when reality stops cooperating with them. The ending was not the explosion. The ending was the silence after. Homelander, physically intact but functionally finished, not by injury but by the public, permanent broadcast exposure of the gap between what he had always claimed to be and what the last 47 seconds had demonstrated, stood on the field in front of 17 cameras and 54,000 people, and felt something arrive in his chest that he had no prepared response for, because his entire life had been engineered to prevent him from ever being in a room with it. The undeniable, fully witnessed, unspinnable truth of exactly what he was. Gohan stood 10 feet away from him, not advancing, not posturing, not doing anything with the moment except breathing, and watching Homelander with that expression. That expression that was not triumph and not pity and not contempt, but something that contained all three and was somehow worse than any of them individually. That was the expression of a person looking at a wound and understanding exactly how it was made. Homelander looked back at him, and for the first time in his life had no performance to deploy, no smile to load, no camera angle to work, because the cameras were already everywhere, and the angle was already everything, and the story was already written, and it was not the story he had written. In the broadcast booth, 17 feeds ran simultaneously into millions of homes. And somewhere in the stadium, in a seat in Section 119, a 12-year-old girl from the Bronx who had been at the building fire 3 weeks ago was watching, and she was not afraid, and that specific, fragile, hard-won absence of fear in one small person in 54,000 was the only victory that actually mattered. The question was whether it was going to survive what came next. The answer to that question was going to be complicated. Everything from here is going to be complicated. The broadcast ran uninterrupted for 11 minutes after the 47 seconds ended, because nobody in the network control room made the call to cut it. And nobody made the call because the person whose job it was to make that call was a 38-year-old producer named Daniel, who had worked in broadcast television for 15 years and had developed, through that experience, a finely calibrated instinct for the precise moment when stopping the feed would make things worse than letting it run. And every cell in his professional body was telling him that this was that moment, that cutting now would be the most visible act of institutional cowardice in the history of American media, and so the cameras stayed live, and the silence on the field stayed live, and 54,000 people and 40 million viewers at home sat inside that silence together for 11 minutes, while the largest public reckoning in the history of Vought International assembled itself in real time without anyone's permission. In Vought Tower, Ashley Barrett watched the feed with the expression of someone watching their house burn from the inside and understanding, with perfect clarity, that there is no version of this where the house survives. The immediate corporate response was a masterpiece of institutional denial, which was the only thing Vought's communications infrastructure was capable of producing when genuine crisis arrived, because it had never been designed for truth-telling and retrofitting. It now was not a 48-hour operation. Statements were issued. Language was carefully deployed. The word investigation appeared in 7 separate official communications in the first 2 hours, used as a kind of verbal spackling compound to fill the visible structural damage before anyone could photograph it clearly. None of it worked. The problem with the B roadcast was not just what it had shown. It was what it had shown to everyone simultaneously, without mediation, without the editing window that was Vought's most essential operational tool. You cannot spin an image that 60 million people saw with their own eyes in real time. You can try. Vought tried. The trying was its own disaster because the gap between the official narrative and the lived collective experience of everyone who had watched the feed was so visibly enormous that the narrative itself became the story, the lie became the evidence, and the machine that had been manufacturing reality for 30 years began, for the first time, to look like exactly what it was. Homelander was removed from public-facing operations within 18 hours, which was communicated to him not as a suspension, but as a strategic operational pause, which was the specific euphemism Vought used when they needed to contain a liability without triggering the contractual clauses that would have activated if they used the word suspension. He received this communication in his penthouse from Ashley, who delivered it with the careful, controlled affect of someone diffusing something explosive by not acknowledging that it is explosive. He listened to it without expression. He said nothing. He walked to the window and looked at the city, and Ashley watched his reflection in the glass and made a private assessment that she had made before about other difficult talent, and that had never once been wrong. The thing behind his eyes in this moment was not sadness, not humiliation, not resignation. It was recalibration. He was not broken. He was deciding what came next. She left the room with the specific speed of someone who wanted to be elsewhere before the decision was made. The governmental response moved faster than anyone in the boys' universe had seen institutional machinery move, which was itself a data point about how thoroughly the broadcast had detonated the existing order. 3 congressional committees announced investigations before sunrise. The regulatory framework, governing Vought's operational license, always nominally present, always practically toothless, a legal fiction that Vought had maintained through the same combination of lobbying, blackmail, and strategic political donation that maintained all their other fictions, was suddenly and genuinely under scrutiny for the first time in its existence. Because the people whose job it was to provide oversight had spent years accepting the fiction of their own authority as real, and the broadcast had made the fiction impossible to accept, and now they were running the specific political calculation of people who have been negligent and need to appear like they were not. It produced a lot of noise. Whether it would produce anything structural was, as yet, entirely unclear. The boys watched the aftermath from a distance that was both physical and psychological. Huey was processing hope, which was the specific emotion he found most dangerous because it had been taken from him before it cost. He was trying to hold it at arm's length, to look at the changed landscape without letting himself feel the change fully, because the history of his life in this world had taught him that the window between things might be different and things are exactly the same again was shorter than it looked, and the fall between them was further. Was already doing the practical work, logging the political developments, tracking the regulatory movements, building the operational map of what the new landscape meant for what they had always been trying to do, because MM's response to significant change was always to convert it immediately into actionable information before the emotional weight of it could distort his judgment. Frenchie was making food and talking to Kimiko, who was sitting very still in the way she sat still when she was doing the deep internal processing that other people did verbally. They were all in their different registers doing the same thing, trying to determine whether what had just happened was a beginning or just a particularly spectacular and public version of the same ending they had always been heading toward. Butcher was alone, which was where he went when the foundational work was happening. Not physically alone. He was in the safe house, surrounded by the evidence of the operation they had just run. but alone in the way that mattered, sealed off behind the specific interior silence of a man dismantling and examining his own beliefs. He had watched those 47 seconds from the booth with the kind of attention that went beyond tactical assessment into something more personal and more uncomfortable, the kind that left marks. He had spent the hours since with the dismantling. Gohan had done exactly what Butcher's entire philosophy said was impossible. He had held that much power, in that much public pressure, at that level of provocation, and used it with restraint, not the restraint of someone suppressing their nature, the restraint of someone expressing it. Butcher kept turning this over, examining it from different angles, looking for the catch, the hidden variable, the place where the philosophy held and the exception dissolved. He kept not finding it. At some point around 4 a.m, he stopped looking for the catch and started sitting with the absence of it, which was harder and more honest and cost considerably more. Gohan found Starlight after midnight, which she had expected because she had learned to expect the things he did that other people wouldn't think to do. He sat with her on a fire escape outside the building where she had taken temporary shelter. Not the apartment she usually used, a different one, a contingency that the broadcast's fallout had made sensible, and they were quiet together for a while. In the way that people are quiet when both of them are processing something large and neither of them has language adequate to it yet. Then she asked him what he was going to do next, and he was quiet for a moment that was not evasion but genuine consideration. He said he wasn't sure yet. He said he understood the situation better now than he had when he arrived, and that understanding it better had made it more complicated rather than less, which she said she recognized as the specific experience of learning how the thing you came to fix actually worked. He laughed, a real laugh, not a performance the first time she had heard it. And she realized it was the first time she had heard anyone in this world laugh like that in a long time. Without any subtext, without a brand attached to it, without it meaning anything except that something was briefly, genuinely funny. She filed it away somewhere she intended to keep. The night around them was the specific quiet of a city that has exhausted itself on its own drama, and somewhere in it the machinery of power was already regrouping, already finding new configurations, already deciding who got to control the story of what had just happened. They both knew that. They sat with it anyway. Morning was going to be complicated. It usually was. Morning arrived in New York the way mornings arrive after catastrophic public events. Not gently, not with the ordinary texture of a city waking up, but with the specific brutal energy of a world that has been running on adrenaline for 12 hours and has not yet found the mechanism to stop. The news cycle had not slept. It had metabolized the broadcast through the night and produced by 6 a.m. a landscape of opinion and counter-opinion, an institutional statement and personal testimony so dense and so contradictory that navigating it required the specific skill of someone who had learned to read the noise for what it was concealing rather than what it was saying. What it was concealing, underneath the volume, was simpler and more destabilizing than anything being said openly. Nobody was in charge anymore. Not Vought. Not the government, not the 7, half of whom had already issued individual statements carefully distancing themselves from both Homelander and each other with the elegant self-preservation of rats reading structural damage. The center that had always held this world's power architecture together. The unspoken agreement that Vought managed the soups and the soups managed the public, and the public accepted this arrangement in exchange for the performance of safety, had been broadcast into rubble. What replaced it was not yet visible. That invisibility was the most dangerous thing in the city. Vought's board met at 7 a.m. in a room that cost more per hour to operate than most Americans earned in a year, and the meeting had the specific atmosphere of a gathering of people who have built their entire professional identities on a structure that has just publicly collapsed and are trying to determine, with the limited tools available to people who have never genuinely operated without the structure, what remains. The agenda was crisis containment, which was the language used when the actual agenda was too honest to be written down. Survival. Individual survival, institutional survival, financial survival, the survival of the specific version of reality Vought had been selling for 30 years that made all their other survivals possible. Legal weaponization is present. Finance was present. Communications was present. The 3 senior board members who had the most to lose from a genuine regulatory investigation were present, and their presence had a specific quality, the quality of people who are trying to appear calm while internally running the mathematics of their own exposure. The meeting lasted 4 hours. It produced 3 actionable decisions and 1 deeply buried acknowledgement that went unrecorded in the minutes. For the first time in Vought's history, they did not know how to control what happened next. The person they needed to control most was not Gohan, though he was certainly on the agenda. The person they needed to control most was someone within their own structure, someone who had watched the broadcast from inside the machine and come away from it with the specific dangerous combination of information and conscience that Vought had spent decades engineering its culture to prevent. A mid-level analyst in the Super Biological Research Division named Marcus Webb, 31 years old, 12-year Vought employee who had been in the building the night of the broadcast running technical support for the stadium's structural monitoring systems, who had watched the calibration being altered in real time, who had the documentation, and who had spent the night sitting in his apartment in Hoboken making a decision that he understood would end the life he currently had and either build something else or destroy everything. By 9 in the morning, he had made the decision. By 9:15, he had made contact, through a channel that Vought's internal surveillance did not monitor because they had not believed it would ever be used for this purpose, with the Congressional Oversight Office that had announced its investigation 4 hours earlier. By 9:30, Vought's internal security division was aware that a leak had occurred. They were 20 minutes too late. The document package was already transmitted. The machine that could have contained it was already moving to contain something that was no longer containable, which was the specific operational failure mode that all corrupt institutions eventually reach. The moment when the suppression infrastructure is still running at full capacity on a problem that has already escaped it. Gohan spent the morning doing what he had been doing since he arrived, which was moving through the city at ground level and helping where help was needed and staying out of the frameworks people were trying to build around him. This was becoming harder. The landscape had shifted overnight in ways that made invisibility more difficult to maintain. More people recognized him now, not just from the broadcast but from weeks of accumulated footage and spreading recognition, and the recognition had a new quality to it that he was still calibrating, something between reverence and the specific desperate need of people who have been without something for so long that when it appears they reach for it with a force that can overwhelm the thing they're reaching for. 3 separate people approached him that morning. A woman in her 60s in a coffee shop in Hell's Kitchen, a teenage boy on a subway platform in Midtown, a construction worker in Chelsea, and all 3 of them said versions of the same thing in different words with different emotional textures that contained the same essential plea: stay, don't leave, don't go, be here, be the thing this place doesn't have. He listened to all 3 with the complete generous attention he gave everything, and he thanked them. And he didn't promise anything, because he had learned enough about this world to know that promises made in the aftermath of spectacle were not the foundation anything lasting could be built on. Jan had not slept either, and the adults in his immediate orbit, Butcher, who had set aside everything else to check on him, and the rotating detail of people whose job was to keep him safe, and who were doing that job with the heightened alertness of people who understood that the broadcast had changed the threat landscape in ways not yet fully mapped, were all operating with the specific careful attention that surrounds a child who has seen something large. He had seen it on a screen, not in person, and screens provided a layer of distance that direct witness did not. But what Ryan had seen was not primarily the power. He had grown up around power. He had felt power come out of himself in moments that still woke him at night. What had moved him, watching the broadcast with his blanket pulled around him and his eyes wide and his processing running at full capacity, was the decision-making inside the power. The specific moment, visible even through 17 cameras, legible even to an 11-year-old who had learned to read adult decisions as a survival skill, when Gohan had assessed what was happening and decided how much to use and used exactly that, and not 1 unit more. Ryan had been told his whole life, in various ways by various people, that power decided its own terms. He had just watched someone prove that it didn't. He was sitting with this like it was the most important thing he had ever been handed, and he was not going to put it down. The fracture that was opening inside Butcher had reached the stage where it was no longer a private internal event. Huey noticed it first. Huey, who had always been more attuned to the emotional subsurface of situations than his general presentation suggested, whose survival in this world had depended partly on the ability to read subtle shifts in the people around him. Butcher was not different in any way that was dramatically visible. He was not softer or more expressive or suddenly given to sentimentality. He was doing all the same things in all the same ways. Running logistics, managing the team, staying operationally sharp, deploying the same dark irreverence that was his primary social register. But there was something different in how he moved through the space around certain conversations. The specific aggressive foreclosure he normally applied to anything that threatened his foundational beliefs. The way he would cut off lines of thinking before they reached their natural conclusions. The particular combativeness he aimed at hope, the way other people aimed it at threats. That foreclosure was sometimes, briefly, not there. It was the absence of a habitual defensive motion. Huey noticed it 3 times in the morning, said nothing, filed it, and allowed himself the private and fragile thought that perhaps the most important thing the broadcast had done was not expose Homelander, but crack the architecture of the man who had dedicated his life to fighting things like Homelander, and who might, if the crack held, become more than the weapon he had shaped himself into. Starlight's public statement, released at 11:15 through a channel that was hers and not Vought's, a detail that represented a line crossed so clearly and permanently that it functioned as a declaration, ran to 640 words and contained, embedded within the careful language of legal exposure and professional consequence, something that 640 words in Vought's world almost never contained. The truth. Not all of it. Not the parts that would require more support before going public, not the internal documentation that Marcus Webb was already delivering to congressional offices, not the full architecture of the institution's crimes. But the truth about the stadium, about the calibration, about what it had been designed to force, about what she had witnessed from the field. She published it, and then she put her phone face down on the table and sat with the specific quality of silence that follows an irreversible action. The silence of someone who has set something in motion that they cannot call back and are trying to determine, with the limited information available after the fact, whether they did the right thing at the right moment or the right thing at the wrong one. Outside her window, the city was already reacting. The statement was spreading faster than anything she had ever put into the world. That was either the best sign or the worst one. She didn't know yet. She sat in her silence and waited to find out. The thing that nobody in the public conversation was yet asking, but that was the question underneath all the others. The question that would determine whether the broadcast had been a turning point or just a particularly spectacular moment in a long story that ended the same way, was not about Gohan's power or Homelander's exposure or Vought's institutional collapse. It was about the system's capacity to regenerate. Corrupt power structures did not end because their current expression was humiliated publicly. They mutated. They found new hosts, new faces, new language, new arrangements of the same foundational components. Vought could be dismantled and rebuild itself in a new corporate configuration within 18 months if the regulatory response was captured, the way the regulatory response had always been captured before. Homelander could be neutralized as a public figure and his function absorbed by whichever of the 7 was most marketable in the new landscape. The public's need for the performance of safety was structural, not individual. Remove the performer, and the need remained, and the need would find a new performer. Gohan understood this in the particular way you understand a disease after you've traced it far enough back to see the root. Not with despair, but with the exhausted clarity of someone who knows that what they have treated today is not what they have healed. He had stopped a stadium from collapsing. He had forced into public view a truth that enough people now knew to make suppression significantly harder. He had given the people who were trying to fix this machine from the inside, Starlight, the congressional staffers now reading Marcus Webb's documents, the journalists beginning to understand the scope of what they had been handed, a window that was slightly wider than the one that had existed yesterday. That was real. He was not dismissing it. But somewhere in the city, the machine was already looking for its next configuration, and he could feel it the way you feel weather changing, in the specific pressure shift before the storm resolves into something new. The reckoning had come. The question of what it reckoned toward was still entirely open. The congressional hearings began on a Tuesday, which was the day the government traditionally chose for things it wanted to appear serious about while retaining the option to not be. The chamber was full in the way that chambers are full when the cameras are present and the political calculus of visibility has been run, and everyone has determined that being seen here, today, in this room, is worth more than whatever else they had scheduled. 3 Vought executives sat at the witness table with the specific expression of people who have been advised by very expensive lawyers to project calm, and have succeeded only in projecting the performance of calm, which is a different thing and visible to anyone paying attention. The committee members asked their questions with varying degrees of preparation and genuine intent. Many of them were working from Marcus Webb's documents, which had been authenticated and distributed through the Oversight Office with a speed that suggested someone in the process understood the window was limited and those questions had edges. Others were performing outrage for their home districts without necessarily wanting the answers their questions technically requested. The hearing ran 6 hours and produced, by the end of it, 3 things: a formal referral to the Department of Justice, a subpoena for Vought's internal communications going back 8 years, and a viral clip of a senior Vought executive saying, "I don't recall," 41 times in 4 hours, that would follow the company's reputation into whatever it tried to become next. Homelander watched the hearings from the penthouse with the volume low, processing them through the specific cognitive filter of someone who has been publicly humiliated but has not yet resolved the humiliation into either acceptance or retaliation, who is suspended in the between state where both options are still live and the decision of which way to fall is being made at a level below conscious choice. He was not panicking. Panic was not his register. His register, in moments like this, was the cold and meticulous assessment of remaining assets, remaining leverage, remaining options. The survival mathematics of a being who had always understood that the only permanent currency in this world was fear, and who was now running the calculation of how much of that currency he still held after the broadcast, and what it could still buy. The answer was less than before, and more than nothing, which was the specific dangerous arithmetic of a wounded apex predator. Enough capacity remaining to be lethal, enough injury to make restraint unreliable. Ashley had not returned his calls since the morning after the broadcast. That absence told him more about his current institutional standing than any official communication would have. He noted it, he filed it. He looked at the city through the glass with the expression of someone not looking at what is there, but at what will be there when he is done deciding. Gohan met Butcher for the first time face-to-face on a Wednesday afternoon in a parking structure in Brooklyn, which was the kind of location Butcher chose for conversations he wanted to have without surveillance, and which communicated, simply by being chosen, that Butcher had decided this conversation was worth having. They stood in the concrete half-dark of the 3rd level and looked at each other for a moment with the mutual assessment of 2 people who have been studying each other's patterns from a distance and are now running the comparison between the model and the real thing. Butcher spoke first, which was his consistent preference in any situation where speaking first was available to him as an option. He said, "You know what this place does to things like you, eventually." It was not a question. It was not quite a threat. It was the specific conversational move of a man testing the quality of what he was dealing with by leading with the hardest truth he had available. Gohan said, "I know." 2 words, flat and honest, and carrying the full weight of everything he had observed since arriving. The systemic rot, the manufactured fear, the machine's capacity to convert anything good into product or threat. Butcher looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, quieter, "Then why are you still here?" The answer Gohan gave was not the answer Butcher had built the question to receive. He had built the question to receive either idealism, which he could dismiss, or strategy, which he could assess. What he received instead was simpler and harder to dismiss than either. Gohan said he was still here because leaving would not make the people who needed protecting need it less. That the problem was not going to follow him back to wherever he came from. That he had the option of leaving that the people inside this system did not have, and that having an option and choosing not to use it because using it was easier than what it enabled you to avoid, that was a kind of decision he understood the shape of, and it was not a shape he was comfortable occupying. Butcher stood with this for a moment. Then he said something that was, for him, the equivalent of a significant structural concession. "You're making it harder to think about all of you the same way." He did not say which way. He did not expand. But Gohan understood the shape of the admission precisely and said nothing in response to it, which was the correct response, which was the response of someone who understood that the thing Butcher had just moved deserved space and not pressure. They stood in the parking structure for another minute. Then Butcher said, "We should talk operational," which meant the conversation was over and also, in its own way, just beginning. The public was fracturing along the fault lines the broadcast had exposed, but fracturing in a direction that was different from what Vought's intelligence models had projected. The projections had assumed that the public, given sufficient institutional messaging, would ultimately revert to the familiar, to the comfort of Vought's authority, to the known shape of the world they had grown up in, to the specific psychological security of a structure they understood, even if they feared it. What the projections had missed was the particular quality of the broadcast's impact on people who had never, in their entire lives inside this system, seen a clear comparison. The problem with living inside a corrupt normal for long enough is that you lose the ability to recognize it as abnormal. It becomes the baseline, the water you swim in, the only texture of reality you have a reference point for. Gohan's arrival had functioned, in the most intimate and unintended way, as a reference point. Not because of the power, because of the choices made with the power. And once a population has a reference point for what a different choice looks like, the old normal does not automatically reassemble. It has to be actively reimposed, and reimposition requires a level of institutional coherence that Vought was, at this specific moment in its history, not capable of providing. Ryan asked to meet him through Starlight, which was the chain of trust he had identified as the most reliable available to him, and the meeting happened in a public park in Queens on a Thursday afternoon with enough ambient normalcy around it. Dog walkers, parents with strollers, pigeons doing the inscrutable business of pigeons, to make it feel, superficially, like an ordinary thing. Ryan was small in person, in the way that children with enormous internal lives sometimes appear small in their bodies, as though the space their mind occupies has been borrowed from somewhere else. He sat across from Gohan on a bench and looked at him with the direct assessment of a child who has not yet learned the social convention of pretending not to study things carefully. He asked the question he had been carrying since the broadcast with the simplicity that children deploy for the questions adults have made complicated. How do you decide how much? Gohan understood exactly what he was asking. He sat with it for a moment, not performing consideration but actually considering, giving the question the full weight of the genuine inquiry it was. Then he said, "I ask what's actually need. Zed, not what would feel satisfying, not what would make the problem impossible to come back, just what's needed right now." Ryan nodded slowly. He filed it somewhere. He would carry it for a long time. Starlight's statement had opened a door that others were beginning to move through, carefully and then less carefully as the number of people moving through it increased the sense of collective safety that individual action alone could not provide. 3 more current Vought employees made contact with the Congressional investigation within 48 hours of her statement. 2 former employees followed within 72. A former 7 member, whose identity would be revealed 3 days later in a leak that was not accidental, provided testimony that addressed the compound fee origin program in terms that made the earlier revelations look like a partial draft. The machine that had been manufacturing silence for 30 years was discovering that silence, like all manufactured things, required continuous maintenance, and the maintenance was becoming harder to perform when the people required to perform it were increasingly uncertain whether the thing they were maintaining was worth the cost of maintaining it. This was the specific inflection point that preceded institutional collapse, not the dramatic public exposure, but the quieter internal withdrawal of the people whose daily labor the institution required, whose compliance it had always assumed, and who were beginning to run their own calculations about what came next. What came next was not clean because nothing that comes after 30 years of institutional rot is clean. The Congressional investigation was real but slow and vulnerable to the same capture mechanisms that had neutered oversight before. The lobbying machinery was still running, the political donations were still being processed, and the specific human tendency to prefer a renegotiated version of the familiar over the genuinely unknown was still operative in enough of the relevant decision-makers to make the outcome uncertain. Vought was wounded but not dead, and wounded institutions with sufficient resources were historically very good at converting wounds into a new configuration of the same essential operation. Homelander was contained but not resolved, and the specific distinction between containment and resolution was one that everyone who had been in this world long enough to understand its history kept returning to in the small hours of their thinking because they all knew what happened when containment failed. Gohan understood all of this with the exhausted precision of someone who had been in enough of these situations to know that victory and the conditions for the next crisis were frequently the same event. That the thing you fix today generates the thing you will need to address tomorrow, that the work was not a problem to be solved but a condition to be maintained. He was still here, he was still moving through the city in the way he had moved through it since the first night, and the city was different, measurably, meaningfully, verifiably different in ways that mattered, and also still the city it had been, carrying its history the way all cities carry theirs, in the architecture, in the culture, in the specific shape of the fears that the architecture and the culture had spent decades producing. The difference was real. The work was not done. Both of these things were true simultaneously, which was the most honest description of where things stood. Not resolution. Not defeat. Something harder and more important than either. The beginning of an actual reckoning, moving slowly and unevenly and without guarantee towards something that might, if enough people kept moving toward it, eventually become change. 3 months after the broadcast, a journalist named Carla Reyes published a piece in a mid-sized independent outlet that had survived Vought's media consolidation by being too small to bother acquiring and too well-sourced to suppress cleanly. The piece ran to 11,000 words and was titled, with the specific plainness of someone who had decided that the subject required no ornamentation, "What We Built." It was not primarily about Gohan, though he appeared in it. It was not primarily about Homelander, though he appeared in it too. It was about the architecture, the specific sequence of decisions, institutional choices, cultural accommodations, and individual compliances that had built the world the broadcast had briefly illuminated from the inside. It traced the Compound 5 program back further than the Congressional investigation had yet reached. It named people who had not been named. It described mechanisms that had been functioning so long that the people operating them had stopped thinking of them as choices and started thinking of them as weather. It was read by 4 million people in the first 48 hours, which was significant, and then it was read by 8 million more, which was more significant, and then it was entered into the Congressional record, which was the specific thing that made it permanent in a way that digital distribution alone did not guarantee. Carla Reyes had been working on it for 6 years. She had been waiting for the window. The broadcast had opened it. Homelander's reemergence happened on a Saturday, 41 days after the stadium, in a format that nobody in Vought's communications team had approved because nobody in Vought's communications team had been consulted. He appeared without announcement in the airspace above Washington, D.C., visible from the ground to anyone who looked up, hovering at an altitude that put him above the city's air traffic, but below its psychological ceiling. Visible, deliberate, unanswerable. He stayed for 40 minutes without doing anything, without speaking, without engaging with the scrambled military response that reached him, and then stopped at a distance that reflected an honest assessment of available options. He was not threatening anyone specifically. He was not performing heroism. He was simply present, in the specific language of presence that has always been power's most efficient communication. I am still here. I am still this. Whatever you think happened, whatever you think changed, I am still the thing you cannot make go away. Then he left. The message was received. It was received differently by different people, by some as threat, by some as desperation, by some as the specific sad spectacle of a being whose only remaining vocabulary was the demonstration of a power that had stopped purchasing what power was supposed to purchase. But it was received by everyone, including Gohan, who had been in the city that day and who stood on a rooftop and watched the figure in the sky and felt the specific weight of an unfinished thing settling back onto his shoulders with the patience of something that had been waiting for exactly this. The conversation that mattered most in the weeks that followed happened not in a congressional chamber or a corporate boardroom or a television studio, but in a hospital room in Baltimore, where a former Vought field operative named Chen was recovering from injuries sustained during the stadium incident. Injuries she had received not from Gohan or Homelander, but from the stampede, from being in the wrong section when the crowd panic began, from the specific cruel randomness of being a human body in a situation designed by powerful people who had not fully accounted for what human bodies did under those conditions. She was 44 years old. She had worked for Vought for 19 years. She had, during those 19 years, done things she had told herself were necessary, and told herself were temporary, and told herself were the cost of operating inside a system you couldn't change from outside, and the telling had accumulated into a weight she carried constantly and described to no one. Gohan visited her because Starlight had told him about her, and because he had learned in 3 months of moving through this city that the most important conversations happen not at the centers of power but at its edges, with the people who had served it and survived it and were now, in the specific clarity that came with distance and damage, able to see it whole. They talked for 3 hours. She told him things that did not appear in any congressional document. He listened. When he left, she felt something she had not felt in 19 years. Like the thing she knew mattered to someone who could do something with it. That feeling was small and fragile and real. It was one of thousands of small, fragile, real things accumulating across the city, across the country, in the aftermath of the window the broadcast had opened. Small things were the only things that lasted. Large things announced themselves and burned bright and left. Small things stayed. The ending Vought needed and worked toward with the specific desperation of a machine that understood its own survival requirements was a return to legibility. Not the old legibility, which was gone beyond recovery in its original form, but a new one. A reorganized, rebranded, structurally adjusted version of the same essential arrangement that could be presented to regulators and the public as reform while preserving the foundational mechanism beneath it. This was not cynicism or pessimism. It was institutional history, the documented pattern of how large corrupt structures survived exposure, acknowledge the specific, sacrifice the individuals most visible in the scandal, implement the procedural changes that address the surface without the root, wait for the public attention cycle to move on and continue. The Congressional investigation was moving toward outcomes that Vought's legal team had assessed with cautious professional optimism as survivable. The criminal referrals were real, but slow. The political will to pursue them to their structural conclusion was present in some quarters and absent in others, and the quarters where it was absent had historically been better funded. The machine was wounded. The machine was adapting. The machine had done this before. The machine had survived everything before. The question it had never faced before was whether this time, the before and after were actually different in the way that mattered. Not just in scale, but in kind. Not just in visibility, but in the thing visibility had produced in enough people to make the usual resuppression harder than it had ever been. That question was not yet answered. It was not the kind of question that got answered quickly. It was the kind that got answered over years, by accumulation, by whether enough of the small, fragile, real things held. Butcher made his decision quietly and told no one directly, which was consistent with every significant decision he had ever made. The team noticed it in the changed texture of his operational choices, the specific places where he stepped back from options he would previously have taken, the conversations he was willing to have that he would previously have closed. He did not become a different person. He remained recognizably, constitutively himself, brutal in his honesty, dark in his humor, precise in his violence when violence was the instrument required. But the foundational axiom, the all of them, every one, no exceptions, had been revised, not erased but revised, in a way that created space for a distinction the old axiom had not permitted. He would not have described this to anyone as hope. He would have described it, if pressed, as an updated operational parameter reflecting new data. The new data was a being who had held more power than anything Butcher had encountered, in more provocation than Butcher had ever designed a scenario to produce, and chosen restraint every single time, not as performance, not as strategy, but as the expression of something Butcher had spent his entire career insisting did not exist in things like that. He had been wrong. He was going to have to do something with being wrong. He had not yet determined what. He was working on it. That was more than he would have been able to say 6 months ago. What this world did to real things was the question Gohan kept returning to, and by the end of the 3rd month, it had sharpened into something more specific. Not what it did, but what it required to survive it. He had watched Starlight survive it through a combination of strategic compliance and carefully protected core values, surviving by giving the machine enough to keep operating while keeping something essential back and out of reach. He had watched Huey survive it, the rough hope that kept getting damaged and kept reforming, not because hope was naive, but because the alternative to hope inside a system like this was not realism, but surrender. He had watched Butcher survive it by converting everything into weaponizable certainty, and now he was watching what happened when the certainty cracked and something more complicated and more honest tried to grow in the space the crack created. He had watched Ryan survive it by being young enough that the architecture hadn't fully formed yet, which was either the most hopeful thing in the city or the most precarious, depending on what happened next and who was around to shape it. All of them were surviving. None of them were intact. That was the cost of existing inside a system that had been designed at its most fundamental level to extract something from everyone inside it. You paid or you left. The people who stayed paid. The only variable was what they paid with and whether what remained was enough to build something with. The last time Gohan was seen publicly in the city before the accounts went quiet, before the footage stopped, before the sightings became unconfirmed, before his presence became the kind of thing people reported but couldn't verify, which was itself a kind of answer to the question of what he had ultimately chosen, was a Wednesday morning on a bridge in the Bronx, during a routine commuter backup that had become an emergency when a truck jackknifed across 3 lanes and a school bus carrying 22 children went through the guardrail and hung over the edge with the specific, perfect, terrible stillness of a thing that is one variable away from catastrophe. He was there in the time that elapsed between the guardrail breaking and the bus completing its fall. He held the bus. He lowered it to the riverbank below with the same careful hands that had held the platform on the first day, the same hands Ryan had watched on a small screen and understood something essential from. The children were unharmed. The cameras were late. Not absent, but late, arriving after the bus was already down, capturing the aftermath rather than the act. He was gone before the first responders arrived. No footage of his face, no statement, no brand, nothing that could be owned or managed or converted into product. Just 22 children on a riverbank, and the specific dent in the guardrail where something impossibly strong had caught the thing that was falling and put it down gently. The last line that circulated, attributed to a journalist who may or may not have spoken to him directly, sourced to a conversation that could not be confirmed, carrying the specific quality of truth that unverified things sometimes carry precisely because they are too precise to have been invented, was this. He had said that the hardest thing about this world was not the corruption. Corruption was comprehensible. It had logic, it had mechanics, it could be mapped and addressed and, with sufficient sustained effort and enough people willing to pay the cost, potentially dismantled. The hardest thing was what the corruption had done to people's ability to imagine the absence of it. The way it had colonized the concept of power so thoroughly that power without predation had become, for most people, literally unimaginable. Not unlikely, not idealistic, but unimaginable, outside the available category set. The kind of thing that when it appeared produced not recognition, but confusion. He had said that changing that, not the institutions, not the laws, not the power structures, but that particular failure of imagination, was the work that mattered most and took the longest and could not be done by one person or in one event, no matter how broadcast or how witnessed. He had said that it required the accumulation of small, undeniable lived experiences of a different possibility, the kind that settled in people's bodies rather than their headline. The kind that a 12-year-old carried out of a burning building and protected in the face of a school assembly designed to erase it. He had said that those were the things that lasted, and then he had gone back to wherever the pull had taken him from, leaving behind a city that was not fixed and not the same. That was somewhere in the impossible necessary space between what it had been and what it might become. If enough people kept carrying the small things, if enough of the small things held. In a world where power had always worn a smile for the cameras, Gohan had been the first thing people feared for the opposite reason, because he actually meant to protect them. And the mirror he had held up to this world, clear, unbranded, impossible to spin, was still there, still reflecting. The question of whether anyone could survive looking into it long enough to change what they saw was the only question that had ever mattered here. It was still open. It would remain open for a long time. That was not a failure. That was, in the specific grimdark arithmetic of a world built on lies, the most honest possible definition of hope. Drop a comment below. Would Gohan's presence ultimately save this world, or would the machine find a way to consume even him? And if you want more stories about what happens when something genuinely good enters a world designed to destroy it, subscribe. The grimdark never stops. Neither do we.